On Monday, armed vessels linked to the Libyan coastguard opened fire on a humanitarian rescue ship in the Mediterranean Sea. Sea-Watch, a German NGO, said assailants attempted to seize its ship, Sea-Watch 5, and forcibly reroute it to Tripoli after it had conducted a rescue of 90 people in distress in international waters. The Libyan coast is one of the main departure points for people fleeing North Africa in small boats, with thousands dying during the perilous journey. The Libyan Coast Guard, which operates largely as a proxy anti-migrant force for the European Union, has now been linked to two recent attacks on humanitarian rescue ships. Late August last year, Libya's Coast Guard reportedly fired on the Ocean Viking vessel as it searched for a small boat in distress. Libya is notorious for its treatment of displaced people and migrants. Rights groups document systematic enslavement, arbitrary detention, torture and extortion by anti-migrant militias that often receive international funds to police Europe's external border. Our first guest is a journalist who was on board Ocean Viking when it was attacked by gunmen linked to the Libyan Coast Guard. Alex Howlett, welcome to MEE Live. Walk us through your experiences on Ocean Viking and how they correspond to the attack that we saw this week.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. So I was on the Ocean Viking last year, around August 2025. And I think it was around Sunday the 25th, we were performing our second rescue and performed our second rescue in the morning. And we were en route to the third in the day when a Libyan operated EU gifted vessel started to approach. Situation escalated very quickly. From what I remember, the comms coordinator on board was up on the bridge. And that's the point where I was heading up and suddenly I was told to get down because she'd been standing at the front of the bridge with her binoculars, observing this fast approaching Libyan operated vessel. And that's when she realized she was being shot at. And she dropped down a moments later where she'd been standing, the glass shattered. And she said to me afterwards that she believed she'd been directly targeted. After this, the Libyan vessel circled the search and rescue vessel 3 times. And I think it was approximately 20 minutes that they were shooting continuously. The crew who were able to went to the citadel in the engine room, and those who weren't able to sheltered where they could. But the bridge, the accommodation level, and the deck where the survivors were all targeted. And I think what's really stark is once we were able to finally emerge, there were bullet holes around the women's shelter sign saying, "Welcome, you are safe now."
Wow.
Yeah, so that was...
Now, both boats, Ocean Viking in this situation you were describing, and on Monday also Sea-Watch 5, called for assistance, sent out Mayday messages to the European mainland. Tell us about the response you received.
Yeah, so I believe that so the search and rescue coordinator sent out the Mayday call, and I think he sent it to the Italian authorities and also alerted NATO. And the nearest NATO asset was an Italian Navy vessel. And there was no response at all at the time. And I believe that the same with the Sea-Watch 5 case on Monday, Mayday calls were sent out as well. The authorities responded, I think, essentially just telling them to get out of this situation as quickly as possible. And I believe Frontex aircraft flew over, but there was nothing with that. And there was no effort to escort them or prevent the situation from escalating further.
And I want to ask you a little bit about the people who'd been rescued. Reflecting on your experience, I mean, what kind of state are survivors in already when they are rescued from this situation in distress? And how were they impacted by this show of aggression from Libyan authorities or alleged authorities linked to the state that they had just presumably been trying to flee?
As you can imagine, it's a horrendous situation that people are risking their lives to flee the possibility of being in the Libyan detention centres, only for them to be found at sea again by the same actors in many cases. And I remember one man that I interviewed saying that they understood the likelihood of dying at sea, but that was preferable to returning to the detention centres by that stage. And I think for a lot of people, it was traumatizing, but I think it was equally upsetting for the crew who a big motivator for them is finally providing this kind of temporary place of safety for survivors, and for that to be jeopardized in such a serious way, and a very real and direct threat to people's lives, I think was also difficult for the crew as well.
Were the crew also concerned that they might be abducted essentially into Libyan and could face punitive behaviour themselves?
Well, I think that was a serious concern at the time, because also it was so unexpected that people didn't know what was going on. And I think because of the fact that the Libyan vessel was circling the Ocean Viking, there was that concern that they would try and board. And obviously, I remember having a conversation at the time where there's a question of, if the EU authorities don't respond in any way, they're sending a clear message that the Libyan coastguard can act with impunity. And I think the escalation that we're seeing this week, where there was that threat of boarding, of the crew being detained or being taken to Libya, we are seeing the kind of escalation that was predicted during that attack in August 2025.
Now, Italy has said that Sea-Watch 5 can make port in Brindisi. Sea-Watch 5 is still at sea. This is, of course, having rescued not just one, but two boats in distress. Brindisi is 4 days sailing away from the rescue location. Why have they been given a harbour so far away from the rescue location?
So I think this is a systematic thing that's done by the Italian authorities, where they assign distant ports, and it's just on a very practical level. That's several days where a search and rescue vessel is unable to operate, is unable to perform rescues. And I think when you look at the total number of days lost over the year, where the vessels are having to travel to these distant ports, it's really significant. And I think it's quite shocking that the authorities have continued with this policy, even with this, where there are survivors in acute medical conditions, but there's also people who are obviously traumatized from the shooting, from the threat of detention, and they now have to travel over 1,000 kilometers to a distant port. And I think last time I checked, on Vessel Finder, it was saying that they're still not going to arrive until 10 p.m. tonight.
Well, and I just sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I was just to drill that message in for people watching. Women have given birth, having been rescued on board these rescue ships in some incidents. And speaking of these rescue incidents, the Ocean Viking, when you were on board the Sea-Watch 5, they had conducted multiple rescue operations. Sea-Watch 5 has well over 100 small boat survivors on board. What would happen to these individuals, to these passengers, if civilian rescue missions like Sea-Watch and Ocean Viking were not able to operate?
Yeah, I think that's kind of getting to the bottom line here, which is every day lost at sea for the search and rescue vessels is a day where people are dying. I mean, the case with the Ocean Viking was they were en route to a third rescue case that weekend. And when the vessel was rendered inoperable because of the shooting, you never knew what happened to that third case, to that boat. And still to this day, you don't know what happened. So I think that's the case with all of this. There's just more people. And I think in 2025 alone, almost 8,000 people died along these migration routes. And this is the very real cost. You just can't reach them in time.
And the cost is now increasing also for humanitarian workers. How dangerous, how scary is it being a sea rescue worker in these circumstances today?
It's a really good question. And I mean, I can't speak beyond my own experiences, but I think the bottom line is that it's a very direct attack to people's lives. And the people doing this work are incredible. And they're already taking kind of a lot of risks. It's incredibly grueling work. But to have to consider whether or not you're willing to risk your own life as well isn't something they should be having to think about at all.
Alex Howlett. No, finish your thought.
I just that's what it's getting to with the EU not taking action, with the escalation with the Libyan coastguard, is that now humanitarian workers are having to consider whether they risk their own lives too.
Alex Howlett, thank you for your time. Now, the EU Commission's Home Affairs Department responded to journalists' questions following the attack, saying every time such an incident happens, the EU delegation reaches out directly to the Libyan authorities to request information about the attack. They added that while these unfortunate incidents occur, they don't know how many others have been prevented precisely because we have been engaging consistently with the Libyan authorities over this issue. Last week, the German authorities raised the security level in the so-called Libyan search and rescue region to level 2. With this, they acknowledged that some of the attacks are with high probability being carried out by the Libyan coastguard against humanitarian workers. The European Union has given the Libyan government 700 million euros since 2015 as part of an agreement to reduce the number of migrants flowing through the country. Much of this money goes to border patrol forces like the Coast Guard. 2026 is on track to be the deadliest year ever for migrant crossings on the Mediterranean Sea. At the same time, military and legal attacks on civilian search and rescue workers are on the rise. Here to talk us through the wider relevance of these attacks is Nathan Akehurst, a migration researcher and search and rescue volunteer himself, currently on the island of Lampedusa between Libya and the Italian mainland. Nathan, welcome to MEE Live. Can you tell us what actually is the extent of EU funding and support for the Libyan Coast Guard? How directly are these powers connected?
Thank you for having me on, Matilda. I'm not quite actually on Lampedusa yet. I'm still in Milan, but I'll be there and airborne in one of the surveillance planes that assists these ships tomorrow. So the precise boats that were used in the shooting that Alex was involved in, and it appears the one that took place this week as well, were transferred from Italy, were former Italian patrol vessels that came through an EU-financed program. It's very difficult to work out exactly how much financing has gone into Libyan security forces in the last 10 years, because often the states are not particularly transparent about these things, but it is a lot. It's in at least the tens of millions. And more than that, the Libyan Coast Guard is not merely a bunch of militias that happens to be getting funding from European states. It's a creature of European states built out of militias that they had alliances with in the aftermath of the collapse of the Libyan state following the NATO intervention against Gaddafi's Libya over a decade ago now. And it's also under the auspices of European support that the Libyan Coast Guard got given responsibility for a much larger area of the Central Med to carry out so-called rescues in, which, as we know, are in fact interceptions where people are dragged back to incarceration, torture, sometimes slavery, and where, as we now know, humanitarian workers are increasingly facing pretty grim consequences as well. And I want to take a slight sidebar here because obviously we are talking about the Mediterranean, but you and I are both Brits, Matilda, and we are in the middle of the current catastrophic meltdown of our government. And I think, strangely enough, that's actually quite relevant to where we are now in the Met. So this is the third. Sorry.
How so?
So this is the third time in about 10 months that the armed forces of a foreign state have fired shots in anger at British civilian humanitarians. Now, I don't want to privilege the value of European humanitarians above the people who are crossing and facing far worse every day. But states are expected to have a particular responsibility to protect their citizens. And, ironically, that's part of the reason, supposedly, that borders exist in the first place. And you'd expect, especially to governments as they are at the moment, very eager to burnish their security credentials, that attacks like these would be an outrage to the British, to the Dutch, to the Italians, to the 20 or so other nations that have had crew members affected by these attacks. But in fact, there's barely a whimper. And when the Member of Parliament for another British crew member involved in an attack on the Ocean Viking in 2023 wrote to the UK Foreign Office to ask if they had so much as raised the issue with their counterparts in Europe who were funding the people shooting at them. The responsible Foreign Office minister replied, no. I'm not paraphrasing, literally just that one word, no. And this is what the so-called border security agenda has got us. States that have already long ago normalized the daily killing, torture, and unlawful incarceration of people fleeing to safety, and now showing that same contempt to their own citizens. And that's a big part of how you get a government that spent the last 2 years being led by the nose by reform to the point of paralysis and collapse, how you get from the border to here.
It's not just the lack of diplomatic protection for humanitarian workers when they are endangered in this way. There are also very targeted, direct, legal, judicial attacks on humanitarian workers. Tell us about the legal risks that humanitarian, especially sea rescue workers, are taking in the current climate.
Sure. So it's in the broader environment has changed quite a bit in the last few years. So you had these very high-profile arrests and trials of humanitarian sea rescue workers several years ago, from 2018 to 19, and most of them, well, all of them were acquitted in the end because it turns out that actually none of the stuff they were doing was remotely illegal, that none of these mendacious charges of aiding and abetting smuggling could be demonstrated to be the case in the courts. And so where the Italian state has shifted to now is more the kind of thing that Alex was talking about previously, the obstruction and harassment of people carrying out rescue, the regular detention of ships for arbitrary reasons, including failure to cooperate with the very forces shooting at them. I was on a ship that was detained in late 2023 for having supposedly carried out too many rescues. That's the absurd world we're living in. And the weaponization of safety inspections and a more bureaucratic than criminal tactics. And then meanwhile, the bulk of criminalization now is going at people crossing, and routinely people who are accused of momentarily putting their hand on the tiller of a boat or similar are being charged with smuggling offences when they are not in any sense smugglers, but refugees themselves.
And it is in this political climate, and after years now of seeing these increasingly sort of criminalisation, harsh deterrence-based policies, it's in that context that 2026 is so far the deadliest year for Mediterranean migrant crossings, and I want to emphasise that because that has been drastically underreported. It's not something I think many people are aware of. Why do you think that is the case? Not the reporting, I mean the increased fatality risk this year. What is contributing to that?
I think there's a range of factors, and one of the interesting things about the beginning of this year was that February was a particularly bad month, more so than it is usually, and that was partially because perhaps because of more embarkations, the increasing crises around the world. But also there was a cyclone, and it was a cyclone that shouldn't have happened, but was a sign of escalating climate change. And it is noteworthy that the same system of extraction and militarization and environmental degradation that is creating crises around the world and causing people to have to up sticks and move is also making journeys more dangerous. And also, I think the key point about this is that we are a decade now into the expansion of border machinery that was supposed to prevent all of this, that was supposed to prevent people from crossing, and has manifestly failed to do so. Now, the Libya thing is not an isolated case in any sense. You have Britain's failed Rwanda deal, which is now potentially costing us 100 million as the Rwandans sue, and the government tries to repeat this same model of offshore prisons in the Balkans. You have money funding security forces that detain, attack, and dump people in the desert and leave them for dead, coming from European states to Egypt, to Libya, to Tunisia, and further afield. You have boats and surveillance equipment and training and coercive diplomacy where countries are promised money to if they prevent people from migrating, and lack of access to visas and diplomatic cooperation if they don't. And so you have the resurrection of this essentially colonial set of structures where European states manage the borders of their former colonies at the same time as providing a massive profiteering opportunity at our expense, a huge upward transfer of wealth at the time when people across European countries are struggling with living standards, and instead their funding is going into militias overseas and weapons companies and surveillance tech companies, supposedly for their own protection. And so, yeah, I think that is the ecosystem and the wider political and economic project in which things like the increase in deaths in the central Mediterranean this year is taking place.
Nathan Akehurst, thank you so much for your time.